We're now on the verge, as I've said, and I've said it for years. I've described this process for years. I'm the world's leading expert on this thing. This whole world system is about to disintegrate within a matter of weeks. We don't know when it's going to disintegrate, but we know we're in an area of a matter of weeks. You have an administration, a government administration, which is assuming that there is going to be, hopefully, some kind of a bounce back of the economy. That will never happen. This economy, in its present form, will never recover from its mad hyperinflationary rush into a general breakdown crisis.
Publicly in his January 1996 announcement of his candidacy for president, Lyndon LaRouche presented the world with the only accurate long-term forecast of the present economic breakdown, the triple curve forecast. That triple curve, expressed by three separate but dynamically interrelated processes, demonstrates a typical collapse function through the decline of the planet's physical economic capital and output per capita and per square kilometer, the rise of financial aggregates, and the rise of monetary aggregates. This reaches a point where the monetary factor overtakes the financial, and you begin to experience acute successive phases of collapse. These three separate curves express a single unified process governing the whole. That process is monetarism, or simply imperialism. It has now been over a decade since Lyndon LaRouche first introduced that forecast, and the failure to recognize it as the only competent method for forecasting has been the leading cause of the present threatened disintegration of the world monetary and financial system. Now, if radical changes are not made within the United States along the lines of a competent understanding of that triple curve forecast, you will not be able to save this country. Look at the process. Start by getting off on the wrong foot. Impose an arbitrary monetary value, like a debt, onto the system. Issue some claims to money. Not money earmarked for specific purposes, just money. Now, to pay off that monetary value, you begin tying it to legitimate things: mortgages, plants, factories, state funds. And when you want to access that money, you take it. You sell the homeowner's debt. You sell the factory. Perhaps you ship it overseas, scale back the cost to maintain it, and make more money off legitimate financial claims. But while you're making that money, you're also collapsing the physical basis to reproduce your economy through self-cannibalization. And you're handing over your sovereignty when you no longer produce in your own country the goods you consume, but rely on an international cartel middleman to handle production and trade. Call that globalization. So as the effects of this looting scheme are felt in crisis after crisis, the decision is then made by the wizards of finance, who have magical powers that you puny mortals cannot even imagine, that the way to bring about an economic recovery is with more money. So it was by 1987 that Alan Greenspan unleashed financial derivatives, a now quadrillion-dollar debt attached to the dollar, in response to the '87 crash. Now you could make money without having an honest claim to goods. You could gamble with imaginary chips and come out with billions of dollars. By 1999, now President Obama's triple-chinned, single-witted economic advisor acted to repeal the Glass-Steagal legislation, opening the banking system to chaos. And by the year 2000, under successive years of almost unfathomable economic incompetence, those derivatives and other Wall Street and similar monetary claims had exceeded the financial claims in the economy. This set the course for the disintegration of the system, which came in 2007, when George Bush and the Congress, led by Barney Frank, Nancy Pelosi, and Chris Dodd, mustered together all their collective brainpower and led the now $23 trillion hyperinflationary charge to bail out the monetarist claims. It is this process, shown in the triple curve, that if continued into the present month of October will drive not only the United States, but the global dollar-based world economy into a new phase of collapse only comparable in its effects to the hyperinflationary blowout of Weimar Germany in the spring through fall of 1923. The Great War, orchestrated by the British Empire through the monarchy, had been an attempt to wreck continental Europe and destroy Germany, which had grown under Chancellor Otto von Bismarck to become the greatest rival to the British Empire's maritime and economic power. The November 11th Armistice Agreement ended the brutality of the war, but it was the Paris Peace Conference, chaired by Robert Lansing, which began the brutality of the peace. There it was concluded that the sole war guilt would be placed on Germany, a conclusion that laid the foundation for the Versailles Peace Treaty and established the Supranational Reparations Commission, which was to determine the physical and monetary debt load to be placed on Germany's neck. The amount Germany would pay, the time in which they would pay it, the amount of goods that would remain for Germany was all decided by the imperialist seven-person board.
The Allied and associated governments recognized that the resources of Germany are not adequate, after taking into account permanent diminutions of such resources which will result from other provisions of the present treaty, to make complete reparation for all such loss and damage. The Allied and associated governments, however, require, and Germany undertakes, that she will make compensation for all damage done to the civilian population of the Allied and associated powers, and to their property during the period of the belligerency of each as an Allied or associated power against Germany, by such aggression by land, by sea, and from the air.
Threatened with renewed war, internal revolutions, and an ongoing British naval blockade that starved nearly 1 million Germans, Germany signed the treaty. Immediately, an audit was performed by the Commission to determine land value, agricultural productivity, industrial productivity, state assets, personal assets, accounts of raw materials, and so on. While the Allied powers knew that Germany could not meet the reparations, the debt was put on them anyway. From 1919 to 1921, Germany was to pay the equivalent of 20 billion gold marks to the Allied powers in gold, ships, commodities, securities, or otherwise. By 1926, 40 billion gold marks were to be paid to the Allied powers. The cost of the war to all the parties totaled 3 times the value of all the property in Germany, and they were to pay it all back. The Allies also demanded that lost ships be replaced by the ton. They demanded food, livestock, coal, chemical dyes, drugs, and raw materials. And if the Germans could not supply the demands out of the excess production, it would be wrenched from the mouths of the people. Throughout the world, this was not seen as a peace agreement, but an act to willfully destroy Germany and drag Europe at some later date into a war made inevitable by the conditions of the peace.
It will remain forever a terrible precedent in modern history that against all pledges, all precedents, and all traditions, the representatives of Germany were never even heard. Nothing was left to them but to sign a treaty at a moment when famine and exhaustion and threat of revolution made it impossible not to sign. In the old canon law of the Church, it was laid down that everyone must have a hearing, even the devil. The new Society of Nations did not even obey the precepts which the Dark Middle Ages held sacred on behalf of the accused.
The poison had already been given to the victim. The system was at that time doomed to fail unless there was a sudden change in demands or cancellation of the debt. However, despite a steep decline in productivity as goods were moved into France, Great Britain, and the other Allied countries, there was one thing the Germans still had: money. The money printing had begun to keep up with the reparations payments. The government was also compensating the workers producing for reparations and maintaining enough social programs to handle the growing number of unemployed, homeless, and hungry. But by 1922, the Reichsbank, Germany's central bank, was turned over to private hands and began printing money for speculation. They allowed short selling of the currency, and the overissuing of the mark took off. Politically, the situation was hopeless. When Wilhelm Kuno entered office as chancellor in 1922, he argued first bread and then reparations, and made the case to the Versailles powers that there must be a moratorium on the reparations and a 500 million mark credit line to stabilize German finances. This enraged France, who was then accusing Germany of faking bankruptcy and intentionally ruining their economy to avoid paying reparations. Germany was already defaulting on payments, and France was determined to secure what was owed to her in coal and coke, and for months threatened Germany with the occupation of the Ruhr. It was clear that an occupation would eradicate the physical basis on which Germany could keep up with their money printing. Even the British, in the interest of keeping Germany stable enough to continue to pay reparations, intervened to try to dissuade the French from invading. But on January 11, 1923, the French invaded, occupying the Ruhr on the grounds that Germany had defaulted on coal payments. The workers' unions and labor organizations had anticipated this and prepared to stand in solidarity against the French. Germany was in no position to meet force with force, and the Kuno government stood behind the unions, backing a passive resistance to the invasion. The workers were on strike, refusing to work for the French, saying let them run their own mines, let them run their own factories. As a result of the strikes, the government made preparations to provide food supplies and unemployment relief to the Ruhr workers. They also swore that the Versailles powers who did not support the invasion, that they would continue paying their debt. But after losing the Ruhr and the production to back these claims on money, Germany was driven into the inevitable final phase of collapse. The preconditions were already set. The occupation, however, was a trigger. From the period of the Ruhr occupation in 1923 into the spring of that year, the printing of money took off. From the spring through the fall, Weimar was literally flooded with marks. The Reichsbank could not keep up with the money printing and gave private banks the authority to print their own banknotes. Companies printed their own emergency banknotes to pay their workers, and there was a constant panic to spend what you had before it was devalued again. There were more Reichsmarks than had ever been printed, and they were being printed faster than ever before. But there was not enough for the people, for their bread, their homes, or their firewood. And on July 26, 1923, the correspondent for the British Daily Mail reported,
"The printing presses are working day and night to supply the Reichsbank with 2 trillion mark notes daily, but there are still not enough to go around. The cashier of my bank handed me 4 million marks in 1,000 mark notes, each worth less than 1/4 of a cent."
People's lives were transformed overnight when the rapid devaluation of the mark took everything they once thought they had.
My father had sold his business during the war together with all the real estate property he owned, and retired from active business. He was, by middle-class standards, a rich man, and intended to live as a rentier on the proceeds of his investments. And the biggest single item was a mortgage on a large agricultural estate of 300,000 marks, whose yield of 15,000 marks per annum would have provided a very good income. All of this depreciated, of course, to zero. My father managed to keep his head above water by resuming some work. The impact on my own life was dramatic. Once upon a time, I had dreamed of a glamorous student existence a la old Heidelberg as the birthright of a rich man's son. The reality, as I've described, was very different.
The culture of Germany was transformed under the fear of securing day-to-day survival, that at any moment everything could be gone. Hans Ostwald, in his 1931 book, Moral History of the Inflation Period, wrote that, reflecting back on the years of inflation, the crazy image of a hellish carnival comes to mind. There were plunderings and riots, painful hunger and wild gluttony, rapid pauperization and sudden enrichment, excessive dancing and the horrible misery of children, nude dancing, currency conjurers, materialist worldviews and religious decline, occultism and psychics, gambling passions, speculation, a divorce epidemic, jazz, and drugs. The money printing reached its height in November 1923 when it took 4.2 trillion marks to equal $1. There was money everywhere, yet the people couldn't eat. And due to the Ruhr occupation and continued strikes from the workers, production had collapsed. The nation originally targeted by the British Empire for war and war guilt was functionally destroyed. The Great War and the peace that followed was intended to destroy Germany through a Versailles Powers imperial monetarist alliance. That destruction marked one phase. Under the conditions of the hyperinflationary wrecking of Germany, the system entered a new phase, where the crisis was used as an opportunity to restructure the still potentially powerful nation to become a pivot for the consolidation of an international financial and industrial empire. Enter Hjalmar Schacht, ally of Bank of England head Montague Norman and United States trader John Foster Dulles. Schacht, on behalf of international financier interests, was appointed in December 1923 as the president of the Reichsbank to rein in the hyperinflation through savage deflation and austerity. He slashed state spending, welfare programs, the security for the poor. Taxes were drastically raised, along with ultra-usurious lending rates. Schacht brought poverty, death, and starvation to Germany on behalf of international interests, who he addressed in a 1922 proposal to then Versailles legal counsel John Foster Dulles.
A solution of the reparation problem. To give Europe a couple of years, say 5, to restore steady conditions in the different countries, Germany must find a loan of, say, 5 billions of gold marks, proceeds of which have to be handed at once to France. My idea is not to issue a state loan, but a loan of private corporations. I want to form, say, 4 private German corporations. To each of these 4 corporations, the German government has to grant the monopoly of exports of some bulk articles, as for instance coal, potash, sugar, and cement, each corporation controlling the export of one of these articles. The monopoly has to be granted for 20 years. The inland producers have to deliver their production to the corporations. The corporations are to issue loans at a total amount of 5 billion gold marks. As the total export of the 4 corporations can be estimated at 500 million gold marks, the amount of the loan will be repaid within 10 years. The loan which I propose is not based on any political treaty. The repayment of the loan is under control of first industrial and commercial people of the highest standing.
With the explicit agenda of corporatist fascism, Schacht, as Reichsbank president, secured international loans from private investors, J.P. Morgan most notably, under both the Dawes and Young Plan. The intent was to consolidate a world network of industrial firms into a single monopoly controlled not by a nation, but a world aggregation of imperial interests. The 1920s saw the consolidation of the international cartels, and by the 1930s, this international conglomerate had chosen the government in Germany to execute their agenda. Of course, the irony of today's situation is that while the conditions are far worse and farther reaching than they were in Germany, the possibility for survival is greater. Our enemy is the same international imperial monetarist alliance, but we in the United States can take them on in a way Germany never could. We write off the debt. We have placed a $23 trillion burden on our people. The claims to that money have sucked our industry dry, and in the last 4 years we have shut down and sold for scrap our previously most productive sectors, throwing millions of Americans out of work. There is no way to keep up with the claims to money, which President Obama would sacrifice lives to pay. So write off the debt. Take the monetary factor of the triple curve and cut it off. There are legitimate claims to money within the system that must be sorted out. All debts tied to real economic activity, obligations to the states, personal accounts, Social Security, and large business and agricultural loans will be honored. And to the extent the values of these legitimate claims have been polluted by the inflated monetary factor, they will be reassessed. But anything that looks like a derivative or a gambling debt, or any arbitrary claim to money, we separate out of our banking institutions and remove them from the public accounts to be placed in a burn pile. Cancel the debt, and do it according to constitutional law. Because what the government has committed itself to as a monetary debt operates on rules outside of the nation's control over our economy and finances. That is a definition of monetarism. So you restrict all transactions in money to the uttering of credit by the government, as is prescribed explicitly in our Constitution. Anything that does not conform to that constitutional standard, we cancel. It's illegal. The monetary inflation has to be depleted in one fell swoop of bankruptcy reorganization under a Glass-Steagal standard. Your monetary values vanish, but your legitimate financial values will remain. Without doing that, you can't get down to the real values. So cancel the debt. Cancel the purely monetary burden on the economy, and with the cooperation of other leading nations who have the same intention to survive, shut down the world's monetary system. Make it illegal, and cancel all claims based on purely monetary holdings. In only that way can you save the world from a worse fate than Weimar 1923, a long dark age. When you have understood that solution as a moral issue, then what you have to do is clear. Cancel all monetary claims using a Glass-Steagal standard. That's the way you clean this mess up.